She tasted like copper and sun, tiny, fierce, and shaking. But when she looked up at him with a serious little brow and asked, "Are you lost too, mister?" Jonah felt something inside him crack in a way that had nothing to do with bone. The pickup was a dented apology of metal against the guardrail, smoke breathing from under the hood. His leather jacket smelled of burnt oil and road. His palms were slick with someone else's blood, and the highway behind him was a long black thumbprint of tracks and choices he could not erase. The girl's voice, plain as a bell, lodged in his throat and made him laugh once, too sharp to be anything tender, and then the laugh shook off into a cough he barely controlled. He had been lost for a long time. The question landed like a compass needle that refused to sit still. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The highway had been empty when he pulled over, a ribbon of cold gray under a pale sun. He'd seen the pickup stalled with a toddler's seat in the back and assumed a blown radiator or dead battery. When he walked around the hood and found a woman cradling a small bundle, the woman's hands already steady, breath ragged, Jonah didn't think of past loyalties or parole stipulations. He thought, instinctively and without permission, about the brother he'd failed and the nights he still owed in silence. He moved because he had always moved for things that screamed. He moved because standing still meant listening to the ledger of his own shame. Maya Alvarez blinked at him, wind paint on her cheeks. Her hair had the stubborn curl of the river girls on the far side of town, and the same backward stubbornness he sometimes saw in his reflection when he let it come. She held a stuffed animal patched in mismatched thread, the seams looking like stitches for a heart that never stopped. Jonah crouched, bike leaning like a tired animal beside him, and offered her the small, honest smile he kept for people who asked simple questions. "Maybe," he said. "Sometimes." Lena Alvarez stood a few feet away with her hands fisted at her sides, jaw working the way a woman who had navigated backdoor deals and midnight cigarette runs learned to do when the ground shifted under her. She sizes people like she sizes portions, enough to fill, not too much to waste. Jonah knew that kind of sizing up. He'd been measured 1,000 times by men and rules and the hard, invisible yardstick of club life. Lena's eyes were dark and practical, and she carried the kind of exhaustion that layered like armor. When she inhaled sharply and walked toward him, because she'd seen the skid marks, because Maya was hers, Jonah felt the subtle weight of the world tilt toward truth.
"You broke down?" Jonah asked, mundane because the highway demanded details as payment for attention. Lena's laugh was a knife edge. "We do that on this road," she said. "We also do not let strangers decide our destiny, mister. Who are you?" He could have told her the part about parole, about the Iron Banner backpatch folded into the past like a letter you can't open. He could have named the nights and the men and the brother he left, said the thing that would make her recoil or pity him. Instead, he told her his given name and a nickname that had come with a map of mistakes. "Jonah. Folks call me Rook. Bike's called Rook too," he said, fingers finding the saddle as if to reassure both of them and himself. Lena did not smile. "Rook," she repeated once, like a test. "You got ID? Parole papers? This stretch is Saints country." The word fell between them with the weight of an untied gun. Jonah had been around enough clubhouse tables to know the significance of that warning. The Crimson Saints patched their territory like kings and guards. Lena's brother, Lex Alvarez, sat at the apex of that emblem, a man with a jaw that could be a promise or a threat with equal ease. Jonah had bled in arenas where Lex's shadow lingered. The name had been a bell he had learned to answer with clenched teeth. Maya, unbothered by code she couldn't be expected to read yet, trotted forward and offered Jonah a half-melted lollipop from the front pocket of her jacket. "You take sugar?" she asked, with the solemnity of treaty-making. Jonah accepted as if the gesture were a truce offered in clean, sticky sweetness. The pickup owner, Lena's voice said it was her car but not her words, explained she was late for a shift at a diner back in town, had taken a wrong turn, and now the radiator had surrendered like an apology. Lena spoke fast and efficient, wrapping commands around Maya like instructions in armor. Get warm, sit in the shade, don't talk to men on bikes if they asked for more than a lollipop. Jonah watched the way she moved, the economy of motion that told him she had rehearsed for emergencies. He saw the same kind of rehearsed moves in clubhouses, the quick check of exits, the calculated friendly smile that could sharpen into steel if coaxed. "Come on," Lena said suddenly, voice softer for Maya. "We're 2 miles from the diner. You can ride behind me, Mr. Rook, but you follow slow and you keep it quiet." Her eyes flicked to him, measuring for signs of threat. Jonah's hand brushed the tank of his bike. Parole forbade associating with outlaw patches and gathering in known clubhouse spaces, but it had never prescribed small mercies for a girl with windburn. His mouth tasted of old smoke and older promises. He considered the alternate. Leave them, ride until the horizon erased him. The road, lately, had been a good hiding place. In motion, he could be anyone's ghost. In stillness, he had to be Jonah Mercer. Names, deeds, debt, piled on his shoulders like river stones.
He followed because she had allowed him to, because she had not slammed the door on compassion, only guarded it. The diner sat in the kind of strip mall that housed both miracles and crumbs. A neon sign that buzzed like a slow heart, chrome stools, and a linoleum floor polished by the gait of generations who had come for coffee and confessions. The place was neutral ground. Lena kept it neutral with an iron will and a ledger of who she would let in. A ledger Jonah had been crossed off for reasons he could not unmake. Inside, it smelled of hash browns and lemon cleaner. Lena moved with an efficiency that suggested she could write a recipe for survival in 5 steps. The regulars, half the bar had patched colors in their mouths, half had none, paid Jonah no mind. They were used to men with patches, used to men without, used to the limp truce that came when a stranger pulled a chair and accepted a cup of coffee without fuss. Lena slid a cup across to him like an offering. "No strings," she said, but there was always a string snagged somewhere. Jonah accepted it. Maya curled against his thigh like she had been riding with men twice her age all her life. "Are you staying?" she asked, eyes mythic in their simplicity. Jonah looked down and saw the small freckle on her knuckle like a map he didn't know he wanted to read. It felt absurd, dangerous, comforting all at once. In his mouth, the word stayed with all its possible betrayals. Stay. Stay meant rooting. Rooting meant exposing the old wounds to light. But it also meant being seen by someone who had not been paid to look and did it anyway. Lena set a plate of pancakes in front of Maya and watched Jonah with a cold warmth, an oxymoron he had been measured by before. "You don't stay here 'cause it's safe," she said, low and honest. "You stay here 'cause I don't toss tudes and strangers onto the road when things break. But you ride on when I tell you to. You keep to the road that you're allowed." Jonah met her eyes then and felt something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. The electric jolt of being negotiated with rather than shoved aside. There was something small and tremulous growing behind his ribs that did not belong to sorrow. It belonged to the dangerous possibility of being needed. "Thank you," he said, 2 words that might as well have been a confession. Lena inclined her head in a way that could be read as acceptance or as a cautionary measure. The diner hummed with the soft conversations of people who had survived smaller wars. A married couple with a yearly argument about a burned pie, an old mechanic with a motherly laugh, and 2 men in faded patches who read the paper like scripture. Outside, the road glinted and waited. The moment that felt like a trap unfolded with the ordinary cruelty of bad timing. A burgundy Ford with a Saints patch on the passenger window idled at the light across the street and then moved on like a shadow that had been quartered. Jonah's hands went to the back of his neck before he understood the motion, habit, muscle memory, a reflex for enemies and the cold comfort of readiness. Lena noticed. The diner watched. Maya, ever honest, rolled her eyes like the world had a simple answer and it never involved fighting. "You said Saints," Jonah said quietly. Lena's eyes didn't flinch. "You have no business knowing Saints or Banner beyond the occasional passing look. You're on parole, Rook. That means stay gone from the things that got you here." He had been a prospect. He had been a man on the inside. The Banner had been more than ink and leather to him. It had been a roadmap and a family until the night colors bled and allegiances overturned with the brutal finality of a turned knife. He'd made a choice that had cost him a brother, and in the aftermath everyone had stood around the wound with candles and rules. No one forgave easily in their circles. No one forgave the man who made the choice. "You could get me in trouble," Jonah said. The admission a small, honest thing. "I know that." Lena's mouth worked the way it did when weighing consequences. "And you could get my family in trouble," she answered, sharp and sharp. "This diner is a lifeline for me and for Maya. You get in the way of that, Mr. Rook, and I will make sure every law that follows you will follow you with a map." The problem settled between them like a herd of quiet animals. Jonah needed a place to put his worn body and lonelier heart. Lena needed a man she could trust not to bring thunder to her child's quiet. Neither had what the other demanded outright. Yet something in the softness of Maya's grip on Jonah's sleeve made negotiation easier than either wanted to admit. He stayed the night, sleeping on a cot in the back storeroom under blankets that smelled faintly of coffee and grease. Lena left a thermos of coffee beside him with a note that read succinctly, "Leave if you must, but keep away from trouble." He woke to the sound of clates and the livelier thrum of the morning. Maya had written a crooked drawing that said Rook and taped it above the cot. The thing, humble and ridiculous and human, sat like a promise above his head. The dilemma grew teeth in the morning light. Rumors traveled faster than anything else in town. Lex Alvarez did not tolerate fraternization that threatened his dominion. Jonah's presence, even as a guardian angel to a busted radiator and a frightened child, was a spark in a dry room. He could ride away and keep his parole, keep the thin white thread that kept him out of prison. Or he could stay and answer to whatever storm Lex decided to point their way, a storm that might take Lena's diner and all her hard-won peace with it. Jonah had been a soldier of code. The idea of abandoning a woman and child in the path of a storm his presence might summon went against something deeper than law. What he could not yet admit was how much he wanted to stay for reasons that had nothing to do with heroics.
He wanted to see Maya grow the crooked way toddlers did, to watch Lena move through life and allow herself small pleasures that didn't require surveillance. He wanted, absurdly, the right to be a man who could stand in public and be recognized without a ledger of guilt trailing him. The dangerous tenderness that arrived with such desires made his pulse a quick, traitorous thing. At the door of the diner, with the morning rush building like weather, Jonah found himself facing the crossroads his life had been circling for years. The road behind him was a ribbon of solitude and careful exile. The road in front was paved with moral mines and the possibility of belonging. He looked at Maya, at her freckled nose, at the way she stuffed a fry into her mouth with the greed of survival, and then at Lena, who folded her hands around a mug like the way a priest folded a prayer. "Stay long enough to pay me back for that radiator," Lena said, half humor, half command. "But Rook," she paused, and the word hung with the weight of a bench in a jail. "No trouble. You walk when I tell you." He agreed, because agreement is a small thing, and because sometimes the smallest decisions open doors you thought would be bricked forever. He would stay and accept the precarious shelter, but the ledger in his head did not close. He had made choices that had names and men attached to them. He wore loyalty like a wound, because loyalty had been the reason he'd failed. Now he would have to live with the consequences of both his leaving and his staying. Outside the diner's glass, a motorcycle thundered past like an omen. Jonah felt the low, familiar ache of the road in his bones, and also the sudden, sharper thirst of something else, the want to be counted for something other than a mistake. He pushed his palms to his knees and let the heat of the coffee warm his fingers. The little girl slid her drawing from above the cot into his hand and pressed it into him like a charter. For the first time in a long time, he felt the possibility, terrifying, luminous, of being lost and found again, in the same town, under the same neon that had hummed for years. The ledger of his life did not promise softness, only the rough calculus of choices and consequences. He had just agreed to add a new line. The dangerous question moved, barely a ripple at first. If he stayed, would he be able to protect what he had no right to claim? And if he left, how could he live with the sight of a small face that had asked him, with the tragic simplicity of children, whether he was lost too? The hard truth was that roads sometimes looped unexpectedly. The easy thing would be to ride until the horizon took him. The harder, more terrifying thing was to stand and take stock of what his staying would cost the woman who had sheltered him and the child who had offered him sugar. The dilemma closed around him like a vice. Choose safety and anonymity, or risk everything for a fragile thread that might bind him to a life he had sworn never to want. Jonah woke to the sound of a spoon clinking against ceramic and the soft radio static that always played low in the diner, Cherries AM, that sang old love songs like they were memos of a better century. He lay for a moment on the cot and let the ceiling tiles narrow into a rhythm of breath. The drawing Maya had taped above his head bobbed with the small draft from the back door, a crooked bike with a smiling stick figure rider, a crude sun, and the word Rook in primeval letters. He traced the curve of the R with a thumb that still sometimes trembled when his hands remembered other things. Outside the diner's glass, Lex Alvarez's district seemed ordinary in the daylight, lawns and mailboxes, kids biking with the fierce, temporary authority of summer. But Jonah knew the ordinary could fold into violence the way a fist closed. He sat up to find Lena already at the counter, her profile carved in the morning half-light, her hair gathered in a utilitarian knot that made her look like armor. Maya was behind the counter, stooled and serious, doling out napkins with the solemnity of a small magistrate. Jonah rose and folded his jacket across his shoulders like a shield he didn't feel worthy to wear.
The diner smelled of coffee strong enough to cure sins and pancake batter sweet enough to tempt saints. "Coffee?" Lena asked. It wasn't a question. He nodded. She poured and slid the cup across the counter with the precise economy she applied to everything. The scrape of stools and the low hum of conversation threaded the small moments into a calm that could be decoy or refuge. Jonah couldn't tell which yet. The Saints were on the north end last night, the old mechanic in the corner said, not looking up from the paper. His voice was casual, but his eyes flicked to Jonah like a dog checking for movement. They'd been moving heavier. Lex had someone roughed up for selling on their patch. Jonah felt the name like a stone dropped into a pool. The ripples made his gut hollow. Lena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Lex," she said. "Not a name, but a thing with edges. He's got a temper. He got worse when his brother went south. Keeps it tight now." "You didn't answer how you broke down," Jonah said, because talk worked like oil in a room, kept things moving and kept the sharp things from rusting. Lena filled a plate with leftover hash browns and set it down between them like a truce. "I took a wrong turn and a radiator blew," she said. "I wasn't going to take advantage, Rook. I thought I was managing fine before you showed up." Her hands were quick and small. She folded a napkin in a way that said she could make a shirt out of scraps and a future out of smaller lies. "My brother's been strict since the split. He watches for anything that looks like fraternization. He'd consider you his kind of threat."
"You got Saints watching the diner?" Jonah asked. He kept his voice low. Some instincts didn't let him howl when it might summon a pack. "They're watching the whole town," Lena answered, blunt as a hammer. "They watch to make sure no one crosses legs. He thinks it's safer if everyone knows their place. He confuses safety with control." Her hands trembled for a beat and then steadied, because that was how she kept living, steadying herself so the rest of the world would not notice. Maya slid in between them, leaning her elbow on the counter like a judge and a child all in one. "Lex is mad because my uncle got hurt," she announced, the information delivered like it was public record. Jonah blinked. That was Alejandro? He didn't want to ask, but sometimes names had to be spoken out and had to be answered. Lena's face folded into a private map, pain, quick and worn. "Lex and Alejandro. Lex is my brother. Alejandro, he's the one who got hurt during the split. It changed things. All of us are walking on glass now." The word split carried the weight of an unhealed wound, and Jonah felt foolish for being surprised that Lena's family had been directly involved. He had known Lex by reputation, by stories told through cigarette smoke and broken whiskey bottles. To hear the Alvarez name close and human in the same breath made the danger feel closer, not abstract. "How long you stayin'?" Lena asked. The question was a gauntlet wrapped in civility. "Long enough to get the radiator fixed and pay you back," Jonah said, and his voice tried to sell him as practical when he felt anything but. The truth that he wanted to stay because a little girl had decided he was less scary than the world, and because Lena's presence in the room unstitched a portion of the armor he'd learned to live in, remained, for the moment, a secret traded only with himself. Lena eyed him. Then she nodded, as if decided he'd passed some small exam. 3 days. You keep your head down. You don't talk club. You don't ride with any patched men. You sleep in the storeroom, and you wake before everyone else to help with the grill. You keep Maya out of trouble. Her list was sharp, efficient, a contract written in the bare language of survival. Jonah could sign with one breath. He did. The hours that followed were small and domestic and lethal all at once. Jonah fixed the radiator like he'd fixed other things in his life, methodical, hands steady despite tremors of reminders. Mechanics had always calmed him. There was clarity to turning wrenches and aligning parts, an answer in torque and torque only. Lena kept an eye on him, watching the man who moved with a practiced reserve. She asked practical questions about parts and labor. She asked nothing about the nights that had left his palms with the ghost sweat of other men's blood. The town was a careful animal, watchful and small. People came and went from the diner with the brisk purpose of people who guarded their own. Jonah felt watched in a way that was different from the glare of clubhouses. Here, eyes were not always hostile, sometimes grateful, sometimes hesitant, often kind in ways that had no agenda. It was disorienting. He was not used to kindness that wasn't a transaction. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the neon buzzed back to life, Lex Alvarez's name returned like an uninvited echo. A local kid slid into the booth across from Jonah and, with the casual cruelty of adolescence, mentioned a meeting at the Saints Clubhouse that night. "Lex got guests," the boy said, fingers absently tracing a ring of grease on the table. "Says it's about boundaries. Says anyone not sanctioned gets trouble." Jonah felt the word boundary like a drawn blade. He hadn't ridden into town to stir trouble. He had come to accept a favor and ride on. But boundaries, in their world, were often enforced by fists in metal. Staying in the diner now was no longer a small mercy.
It was a risk of being seen and judged and blamed by forces that measured people by their past more than their present. He considered telling Lena outright that he could leave, that he could take his parole and his regrets and keep them where the law wanted them, in quiet exile. But as he looked at Maya across the counter, quietly setting out ketchup and salt like she was arranging a small army of condiments against hunger, he couldn't make the words move from inside his chest to outside. The idea of leaving her in a town watched by Lex, with no one but her mother to shoulder the burden, felt like a cowardice he couldn't stomach. "Screw this," he heard himself say under his breath, and the phrase surprised him with its bluntness. Lena glanced up, watching the unrest trail across his face like a storm front. "If you mess anything up tonight, Lex will know you were here," she said. It wasn't a threat, barely, but it carried the weight of a mother measuring danger for her child. "And he won't just tell you to leave." "I know," Jonah said. The knowledge lived in him like a bruise. "But I also know what it looks like when people get taken by fear. Lex's rules look like protection, but sometimes they're just a hunger for power." He kept his voice low, because words could be ammunition, and because the stakes were too big to waste on rhetoric. "I don't plan to be around when anything happens. If Lex makes trouble, I don't start it." Maya, overhearing the exchange, rolled her eyes as if both adults had already failed a basic exam. "You sound like a grown-up arguing about taxes," she said, with a candor that made Jonah laugh out loud, a sound sharp and a little rusty with disuse. Lena's smile was quick and private, softening a face that rarely allowed softness. Night settled and the diner closed. The neon hummed like an exhausted creature. Jonah cleaned the counter, wiped down the chrome, and stacked plates as if each plate could balance out a sin. When the town's lights blinked, alert and watchful, Jonah realized his sleep that night would not be of respite. He stayed awake because staying awake meant watching, because watching felt like paying attention, because long ago he'd watched a brother die, in part because he'd slept through the moment a decision needed to be made. Maya fell asleep in the storeroom on a cot of her own, clutching the same stuffed toy she had. When the town's lights blinked, alert and watchful, Jonah realized his sleep that night would not be of respite. He stayed awake because staying awake meant watching, because watching felt like paying attention, because long ago he'd watched a brother die, in part because he'd slept through the moment a decision needed to be made. Maya fell asleep in the storeroom on a cot of her own, clutching the same stuffed toy she had in the pickup, breathing small and clean in sleep. Jonah listened to her and to the house's bones settling. He rubbed his fingers together, remembering the texture of his brother's palm the night it had been taken, remembering the sound of a name spoken like an accusation. He thought of Lex, sitting in his throne like a man who could not see shadows for what they were. Jonah thought of the ledger of his life and the entries that couldn't be erased. He thought of Lena and the way her hand had been steady when she closed around a coffee mug, and of the way she had judged him not by patch, but by action. Somewhere in the hours when town lights were just pinpricks of survival, Jonah made a small, dangerous promise to himself. He would not bring anyone's war to Lena and Maya. He had failed before. If he failed again, it would be on his terms. He would keep watch. He would ride out if danger pressed too close. He would not be the cause of pain for a little girl who had asked with the simplicity of the unjaded whether he was lost too. The world had a way of answering promises with tests. Jonah knew that. He also knew that the heart, when it found a thin place to rest, asked for courage the way a thirsty man asks for water. The next days would demand that courage of him, in quiet choices and in sudden moments when words were insufficient and action necessary. For now, he drifted in and out of a sleep that tasted of coffee and motor oil, of pancakes and the road, guarded by the soft, steady breathing of a small girl whose faith he had not yet earned, but who had given him something he hadn't known he'd needed, a reason to consider staying. The knock at the diner's back door came like a summons, not the polite kind, but the kind that drags sleep from the corners of a house. Jonah's body went hard like a wire pulled taut. He'd been awake long enough to know how danger measured itself, in sudden sounds, in tires on wet pavement, in the way the town's dogs ceased to bark. He pushed himself upright, heart already counting the beats of an old rhythm rehearsed in the asphalt of other lives. Lena answered the knock with the careful composure of someone who had managed worse. Jonah watched her through the small window that separated the kitchen from the main room. Lex Alvarez filled the doorway like a shadow pressing into light. He was not alone. 2 saints flanked him, leathered and compact with the sort of heat that could make even a well-meaning gesture look like provocation. The bell above the door tinkled with the kind of finality that made people in the diner mutter and press napkins into palms. "Lena." Lex's voice was flat and precise. He stepped over the threshold and the air seemed to count its breaths differently. He looked at Jonah with a slow, assessing stare that carried the gravity of a verdict. "Who is he?" The question landed like an accusation. Jonah straightened from his place behind the counter. When Lex's gaze fell on him fully, Jonah felt the weight of every night's decision settle into his ribs. It was one thing to be tolerated. It was another to be squared, measured, and found wanting. He had been measured like this before, in clubhouses, in back alleys, at benches with men who had the power to decide a man's fate with a motion of their jaw. Lena's answer came too late. The space between question and reply shivered with something older than fear: recognition. Lex's eyes narrowed, and something inside him closed like a trap. Jonah read the shift in the lines of Lex's face and understood, in the way a man understands a gun, that the conversation had become something else. "This is Jonah Mercer," Lena said, her voice steady, but the hand on the counter white-knuckled. "He helped us with a radiator. He's—" "Rook," Jonah authored quickly, because names are tendrils you can throw to steady a boat. "Rook, I'm on parole. I mean no trouble." Lex didn't need the whole sentence. His mouth quirked with a kind of humor that had teeth. "Rook," he repeated. He pulled back his leather to reveal nothing, no patch that belonged to the banner, no club insignia, but the presence of a man like Jonah in his territory had been noted. "You were Iron Banner." The diner quieted the way a room does when a storm's first low thunder rolls across the horizon. Jonah felt 1,000 eyes like small coins against his skin. Lena's jaw clenched again, a brittle sound only he would have known as a sign of internal conflict. Lex had not asked for confirmation. He had made the claim and let it hang. "I was," Jonah said. The simple admission felt like removing a bandage slowly, feeling the rawness of what had been hidden. He did not say anything else. He could not make the story shorter or kinder. He had been the sort of man who carried the weight of a patch like a Bible and a curse both. Lex's chin lifted. "You got a say in what happened to Alejandro?" The name was a blade. It was the one that had cut Lena's family open and left them raw. Jonah felt a cold crystallize in his gut. Alejandro Alvarez, Lex's brother, the man who'd been hurt during the split, that injury had been a pivot in the town's story. Whispers had been stitched into the diner for years about who had been present that night and who had made decisions that bled into another man's life. Jonah had been there. He had walked away. He had not told the truth. The saints shifted. Maya pressed herself against Lena's hip and looked up, eyes wide as saucers.
Jonah glanced down at the small hand clutching lace on Lena's apron and felt a tilt of panic hard enough to burn. "I don't know what you're saying," Lena said, and the sentence fractured like an old plate. It was half denial and half a plea. She had built her life on not being devastated in front of her child. But the truth had a way of finding the loose seams in people's defenses. "You do," Lex said. He stepped forward with the deliberate grace of someone used to owning space. "You were there that night, Jonah. You made a choice. You let a man bleed because you thought it would save the banner. Alejandro paid for it." The accusation hung in the air, a scent that made Jonah want to lash out and confess, and then swallow himself to stop the confession, like a man stopping a flood with both hands. Bits of the past unspooled like a reel. The night when the banner and the Crimson Saints had come to a crossroads, the impotence of law in the face of tribal codes, the raw edges of men who thought their choices carved destiny. He'd chosen the banner's path years ago, and that choice had carried consequence, one that had landed Alejandro Alvarez between life and hospital corridors. But the truth was more tangled than Lex's flat condemnation. Jonah had not set out to let Alejandro get hurt. He had been given orders and had followed them in a way that had preserved one thing and sacrificed another. It was a humiliation he'd carried privately. He had chosen motion over confrontation, an action that cut a man he had known to pieces by proxy. "Is that what you think?" Jonah asked, and his voice was lower than the friar's. "That I let him? That I stood aside and let them?" He couldn't say it, not entirely, without dragging another man's life into the dirt. He had been the kind of man who had learned to live with the shadow decisions left on his soul. Lena's face crumpled with a grief that was equal parts mother's protection and sibling betrayal. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said, the question less to Jonah than to the world that had always taken from her family and never apologized. Her voice trembled like a wire keying under pressure. "You were there." "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to hate me," Jonah replied, raw as an exposed nerve. The admission peeled back every reason he'd given himself for staying quiet and left the core. Fear. Not fear of Lex's retribution alone, but the fear of losing the fragile trust he'd been given, of having the small good things he had found,
The diner, Maya's laughter, the light behind Lena's eyes, taken away because he had, in the past, been part of a thing that bled people. Lex's face frightened into something less human and more statued. "You don't get to buy back what was lost with pantry coffee and scraped wrenches," he said. "You don't get to sit in my sister's diner and pretend you weren't part of the blade that cut my family." The phrase cut. Jonah felt the room tilt into shards.
People murmured with the kind of nervous energy that makes everyone lean closer to a fight they don't intend to win. Maya pressed herself closer to Lena, as if she could be a small bridge between the fracturing adults. Lena's hand went to the kid's shoulder and squeezed, a small anchor in the storm. "It wasn't like that," Jonah said, but he saw in Lena's eyes the fast recalculation of someone who had trusted a man and now found that trust was not whole. She stiffened, the way a harp string tightened, and Jonah realized with a cold, awful clarity that he'd been given the keys to a small miracle, and he had let the lock rust without telling the owner why. "Tell me how it was," Lex demanded. "Tell me so I can decide what returns to ash." There was a new, stranger presence at the diner's doorway now, a thin man in a patched jacket Jonah half recognized from a decade of crosstown whispering. He'd been a Banner associate years ago, a man who owed Jonah a debt of silence. He came forward now, like a rat to light. "He was the one who pulled back," the man said. "Jonah took the easy way out. He left Alejandro there." The accusation was not evidence, but it landed like grenades anyway. Jonah's nostrils flared. The memory the man invoked had teeth, the sound of a breath pushed out too fast. Jonah wanted to argue, to curve the memory into the shape of a man who had tried. He didn't. Words would be nails hammered into a coffin if he fought them now. The truth was crooked. It would never be a straight line through the hearts of the people gathered in that dusty room. Lena's face went white and vivid, as if someone had painted it with wrong colors. Anger rose in her voice like steam. "You—" She stopped, the sentence breaking. "He said you'd saved someone else." Her glance flitted to Jonah, searching for proof that he had tried, that salvation had been an act he had attempted and failed at, not a moral choice of convenience. Jonah's voice was a low, dangerous thing. "I couldn't save him all the way," he said. I tried to stop it from getting worse, from becoming something a court couldn't fix. But I made choices that hurt people. I left because staying would have gotten him killed and me buried in the same hole. I thought." He couldn't finish. The rest of the sentence would be the sound of his cowardice and his calculus laid bare. Lena's eyes went to the floor. The child in her face receded like a tide. "Why didn't you tell me, Jonah?" The question had the weight of a verdict. She was not asking to be absolved. She was asking how much of her life had been built on omissions. The diner hummed with the pressure of a room holding a truth it had not been invited to bear. Maya's small voice broke the silence with the kind of cruelty only children can wield. "You lied to me. You told me you were just a biker who got a flat." Jonah felt the words like small knives. He had lied. He had left out the heavy parts because he had hoped kindness could be divorced from the ledger of his sins. He had wanted to be allowed a small place that didn't consider him a walking indictment. The child had gutted that hope with one earnest sentence. Lena's chair scraped. She stood up, and the movement was a small, devastating thing. For the first time in hours, Jonah saw her not as a woman armor-clad, but as a person who had been given a choice she had not earned, but was being forced to make anyway. Her damage was private and deep. "I kept you here because I thought you wouldn't bring trouble," she said, voice raw. "I wanted to believe people could change. But maybe I was fooling myself." The fracture was not loud. It did not break into a brawl or a scream. It dissolved in the soft ways that matter. In Jamie's diner, turning away from Jonah's face, in eyes that had offered refuge a morning ago, now calculating exit strategies. In Lex's quiet satisfaction that a threat had been named and therefore addressed. Lima turned away to the kitchen and pulled her apron over her head like a shield she couldn't wear anymore. Jonah's world thinned down to the size of the room and the small hand still in Luna's pocket. He had come for a radiator and a night's refuge and had stumbled into the raw tissue of a town's memory. He had wanted to stay because of a child's honest trust and a woman's guarded mercy. Now that mercy had inevitability attached to it. If Jonah remained, Lex would make it a claim on the Alvarez family. If Jonah left, he would be leaving Lena to fight the aftermath of his existence. He could not bear to watch Maya's face fold with the hurt he had caused. The little girl's eyes were two big moons imploring him to fix what he had broken. He wanted to say the right thing, to make an apology that resembled absolution, but he had never been good at that.
His words were coarse and insufficient. "I'm sorry," he said finally. The words scraped like gravel in his throat. "I should have told you. I thought keeping the past down would keep you safe. I was wrong." The apology landed in the room like a small animal. It did not mend the fractures. It did, however, make the next move necessary. Lex's jaw tightened, and he put his hand on Jonah's shoulder with a pressure that was almost cartoonish in its threat. "You got till sundown to clear out," he said, voice cold as coin. "You bring war or you bring danger to my sister's home, and it'll be on you. Don't make me make more choices." Jonah's mouth opened and closed. He wanted to argue, to stake himself in a different way, to say he would face whatever Lex wanted and not let Lena suffer. Instead, the room boiled quiet. Lena's shoulders went up and then down as if her body were making a decision about whether to hold together or disband. She looked at Jonah with the complicated face of a woman who had built an entire life on keeping certain doors shut, and now saw the lock turned. "Go," she said at last, and the word was a stone. "Leave before Lex decides I didn't go far enough."
Jonah stood frozen, the sun sliding through the diner's window and painting the chrome in long, mocking bars. He thought of the road and all the anonymity it offered, and of parole officers who loved rules more than people. He also thought of the child's freckled hand and the crooked drawing he had pinned above his cot. He imagined leaving and waking every morning to the face of a woman who had believed him and who had been betrayed by the partial truth he had given her. He imagined Lex quietly beheading his tenuous peace, watching as Lena's diner became a battlefield of small cruelties. He imagined going without being asked, the way men like him had been erased from their own stories. Jonah exhaled. The breath left with the humble force of surrender, or of a new, dangerous resolve. He couldn't tell which yet. He had been given a choice by a woman who could not have known how it would press on him: leave and preserve what remained of the life he'd been avoiding, or stay and prepare to take the blows that his past had earned him. He walked to Maya and knelt to her level. His hands were steady, where everything else felt frayed. "I'm sorry I lied," he said into the child's wide eyes. "I wanted to be someone you could trust." Maya looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing that like a judge considers evidence. Then she leaned forward and hugged his neck like she was insisting on her own kind of justice. "Don't go," she said, so small a thing and so enormous. Jonah's chest felt as if a thing inside him had been split open and something like longing poured out. He had been a man who measured himself in roads and obligations. Suddenly he found himself counted by the warmth pressed against his collarbone. The urge to stay warred with the knowledge of what staying would cost. The ledger in his head wrote itself faster than ink could dry. Lex's shadow folded back to the doorway, his commands unspoken but understood. Jonah pushed himself up. He looked at Lena, the woman who had trusted him with the life of her child, and felt the savage truth unroll. He had fractured trust, and that fracture could not be mended with one night's worth of service. "I won't drag them into anything," he said to Lena, a vow balled tight. "If you tell me to go, I go. If you want me to stay and amends, I stay. But whatever you say next, say it with your eyes open." Lena stared at him like she was cataloging the cost of a decision. Her voice when it came was thin as paper. "You have until sundown, Jonah. Get out of my mind and my kitchen if you can't be someone who keeps us safe." Her words were not forgiveness. They were not trust. They were a condition, a boundary laid down in the rubble of revelation. Jonah nodded once. The nod felt like an oath, and like an undoing. Maya buried her face into his jacket and clung, and for a second Jonah was the only man in the world who mattered to a small child who had already learned too much. As he stepped out into the neon-lit street, the town's noises took him in like a tide. Lex watched with a quiet vindication that made Jonah's bones ache. He had come to the diner for a radiator and found himself at the center of an old, sharp wound. He had not expected to be judged, and he certainly had not expected to be turned away by the first woman who had looked at him like another human and not a number. The sunset made long, dramatic shadows across the asphalt. Jonah walked to his bike and felt the cold metal like a familiar truth beneath his palms. He had so many chances to be small from here on,
to ride and not look back. He also had chances to be brave in ways that didn't involve bullets. As the diner hummed behind him like an injured animal, he understood the price of both. The fracture had been made, trust had been splintered, secrets had been exposed, and the town's map had redrawn itself around the new damage. Jonah sat on his bike, the engine a low, questioning growl. He could leave and save himself. He could stay and make whatever reparation he could, knowing Lex's patience had limits. He thumbed the starter and felt the vibration slide up into his palms. Maya's small drawing flapped in the window like a tiny flag of surrender. Jonah had until sundown to decide whether he would let the world take what he'd been given quietly, or whether he would stand and test those limits, for the sake of a child who believed a lost rider could be sound. Jonah sat on the bike, the engine a low chrome heartbeat, and felt the sun eat the day until it was little more than a bruise behind the hills. He could leave. He could ride until the map of his life blurred and he became a story told only in cautionary tones. Instead, he slid off the seat and walked back into the diner, each step like a decision made under oath. "Lena," he said. Her face had gone pale with the tension of someone who'd rehearsed for betrayals. "You told me to go. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to make what I broke not worse." She measured him with the same steady anger she'd used against Livewires. "Don't make me a martyr." Adults were complicated and dangerous. Lena's jaw trembled, then softened in a way that surprised Jonah and flayed him in the same motion. "Then don't make me choose between my brother and my daughter," she said quietly. "If you want to help, then help in ways that keep us whole. If you want atonement, make sure nobody pays for your past but you." He realized suddenly what the redemption he wanted would cost. Not just his safety, but the court of law he had been hiding behind, and perhaps his freedom.
He found the fierce, ridiculous courage that had once made him rush toward noise and put it into his next words. "Tell Lex I came willingly. Tell him I'm ready to answer for whatever came from my choices. If he wants blood or justice, have him come get it from me, not from you." Lena's face shifted. Fury warred with the maternal instinct. He found the fierce, ridiculous courage that had once made him rush toward noise and put it into his next words. "Tell Lex I came willingly. Tell him I'm ready to answer for whatever came from my choices. If he wants blood or justice, have him come get it from me, not from you." Lena's face shifted. Fury warred with the maternal instinct to protect. She wanted to say no, to shield her daughter from any man's revenge. But when she looked at Jonah, really looked, with the tired honesty of someone who had learned to read people's debts, she saw a man offering himself, not posturing. It pulled something soft out of her chest she hadn't let show in years. "You're mad," she said, and there was a laugh hiding in the words. It broke when she added, "But fine, if you're going to stand as the culprit, you'll do it openly. You go to Lex. You tell him you were there. You tell him you sacrificed safety for a choice you made. I'll stand where I can without making Maya a target." Jonah's throat closed. He thought of the ledger of his life and how ink-dark each entry was. He could feel Lex's shadow already like a pressure at the diner's door. He knelt, and, for a moment that felt like confession, he brushed his forehead to Maya's hair. "I won't leave you alone when it matters," he promised, and the words were both vow and plea. Night was a knife edge as they stepped into it. Jonah rode to the Saints clubhouse with Lena and Maya trailing behind in her old pickup, Lena's knuckles white on the wheel. The clubhouse loomed like a citadel of retribution, iron and unforgiving voices. Lex stood on the steps, a judge and a storm in one frame. Jonah dismounted with his hands in plain view and walked toward him like a man walking into his own verdict. "You came alone?" Lex said, and it sounded like surprise with its teeth showing. "I came to take responsibility," Jonah replied. He told the story, fast, ragged, not seeking absolution but asking for a chance to be judged fairly. He didn't spare himself. He named the failures, the choices, the ways he thought an end justified cuts. Lena watched from the truck with Maya clinging to her side, face stricken but steady. For a long moment, Lex's expression was stone. Then something within him, grief perhaps, or the ugly arithmetic of pain, shifted. There was a long pause in which Jonah thought the man would spit verdict and walk away, leaving shards in the Alvarez family's hands. Instead, Lex stepped forward, and an emotion that shocked everyone, struck Jonah across the face, not with the intent to maim but to mark ritual and to measure a price. "You'll answer in court," Lex said low, the edge of his temper calmed by the formalism of law. "You don't get to hide behind my sister." Jonah's jaw stung,
blood and heat blooming bright. He could have fought, could have argued that this was an injustice, that justice wasn't redemption. Instead, he bowed his head, the gesture not of a defeated dog, but of a man finally willing to carry his sentence openly.
"Take me in," he said. "Prosecute me. Let what I did be decided by something other than club justice." Lex considered him. Around them, men shifted, the old codes making room for a different ritual, accountability rather than vengeance. Then, with a sharp nod, Lex signaled his men. Jonah didn't resist when they cuffed him. He looked once toward Lena, her face in the truck, wet by the streetlight, and she mouthed 2 words that folding halls of men could not hear. "Be safe." Jonah walked to the patrol car with a kind of strange relief biting his ribs. He had traded freedom for the promise that Lena and Maya would be left to their quiet life, that the diner's neon would continue to hum without being torn down by a vendetta. Lena left the truck, and for a heartbeat crossed the distance between them. She reached out and caught his hand where the chain bit into his skin. "You could have left," she said, voice cracking. "I couldn't," he answered, "not after she asked me if I was lost too." She pressed her forehead to his knuckles in a gesture that was neither surrender nor forgiveness, but something like truce and benediction. Then she stepped back into the truck and drove away before anyone could frame the moment with words. Maya waved at him until the taillights swallowed them. As the car door shut and the cruiser rolled away, Jonah felt the ledger in his chest shift. He had traded the long anonymity of the road for a short, sharp accountability. It might not be the redemption anyone promised, but it was the cleanest thing he'd done in years. Name the harm, accept the consequence, leave the people he loved intact. In the rear view, his reflection was a stranger with someone else's shadow. But he carried a